There is a specific hour of every single day in which the poor man and the rich man do precisely the same thing with their minds. And it is this hour, more than any other, that decides which one of them remains poor. That hour is the one just before sleep. I want you to sit with that claim, because I intend to prove it to you tonight, across 500 documented interviews and 20 years of research into exactly what separates the men who accumulated genuine fortunes from the millions who never did. The finding surprised me when I first uncovered it, though it no longer surprises me at all. Remember this. The mind does not distinguish, in the final minutes before sleep, between a statement offered to it deliberately and a statement it merely happened to overhear from its own habitual thinking. It accepts what is placed before it in that specific hour, with a receptivity it does not possess at any other point in the day, and it organizes the whole of a man's instinctive decisions for the following 24 hours and for every day thereafter around exactly what it was fed in that narrow window. I want to give you a figure, because I have found audiences receive a claim more seriously when it arrives with a number attached rather than a sentiment. Of the 500 men I interviewed across 2 decades, I asked each one a specific question. Could he describe, in exact terms, the content of his own thinking in the 10 minutes preceding sleep across the years before his fortune was established? 411 answered with striking specificity, as though the question required no reflection at all, because the pattern in question had become so habitual they could recite it without hesitation. Every one of the 411 described a deliberate, repeated, specific thought, never a vague hope, always an exact statement, spoken or silently rehearsed, oriented toward a definite objective. Consider the cost of never learning this. There are millions of men and women who spend that final hour before sleep in a condition I have come to regard as the single most expensive habit I have ever documented. Reviewing, in exhaustive and unguarded detail, every worry, every debt, every grievance, every fear the day has produced, precisely at the hour their own mind is least equipped to resist accepting it as settled fact. I do not say this to insult these men and women. I say it because the arithmetic of their situation demands an explanation, and the explanation the majority accept. That poverty is simply their circumstance, their bad fortune, the hand they were dealt, and nothing more. Is, in the overwhelming majority of cases I examined, false. What they lacked was not opportunity. In case after case, I traced closely enough to be certain of the facts, the opportunity had been present, at some point, in a form nearly identical to the opportunity a wealthier man beside them had recognized and seized. What they lacked was the specific, deliberate discipline of controlling what their own mind absorbed in the 1 hour of the day that mattered more than all the others combined. I want to describe the specific shape this failure takes, because it rarely announces itself as anything so dramatic as despair. A man finishes his day's labor. He eats. He speaks with his family, if he has one, or sits alone if he does not. And then, in the final quarter hour before sleep claims him, his mind, left to its own undirected habit, drifts toward whatever concern pressed most heavily that day. A bill not yet paid, a slight not yet forgotten, an ambition not yet realized and quietly assumed, by that hour, never to be realized at all. He does not choose this drift deliberately. He has simply never once considered that the drift itself was a choice available to be made differently. I intend to correct this tonight. Consider the case of Silas Wrentham, a harness maker's apprentice in Council Bluffs, Iowa, in the autumn of 1906. Wrentham was 22 years old, unmarried, earning $6 a week, and possessed of a specific and deliberate habit that his fellow apprentices, when they became aware of it at all, regarded as faintly peculiar. Each night, before he permitted himself to sleep, Wrentham spoke aloud, in the darkness of the small room he rented above the shop, a single exact sentence he had composed himself, and had never once altered in its essential wording. He did not whisper it. He did not merely think it. He spoke it, aloud, 3 times, with as much conviction as he could genuinely summon, before he allowed his mind to release itself into sleep. I want to describe how this habit began, because the origin matters to what follows. Wrentham had, by his own later account, spent his first several months as an apprentice in a state of considerable private discouragement, watching the shop's proprietor make decisions Wrentham privately believed he could make equally well if only given the chance. Rather than continuing to dwell on this discouragement in the ordinary, unguarded manner most young men would, he made a specific decision one evening, after a particularly disheartening day, to compose a single sentence that named exactly what he intended to become, and to speak that sentence deliberately each night in place of the discouragement that would otherwise have occupied the same hour. I want to give you the exact sentence, because the specificity of it matters more than any general description could convey. Wrentham did not say something so vague as "I will be successful," or "I deserve good things." He said, precisely, "I am becoming, day by day, the proprietor of a harness and leather goods concern of my own, and every skill I acquire in another man's shop tonight is capital I am depositing toward that exact end." That was the whole of it, specific, tied directly to a definite objective, repeated in identical form, without variation, night after night, for reasons he could not, in that first year, have fully articulated even to himself. I want you to notice 3 specific qualities in that sentence, because a man composing his own will need to build them into his as deliberately as Wrentham built them into his. First, it named an exact outcome. Not general success, but a specific trade and a specific position within it. Second, it named an exact mechanism connecting the present moment to that outcome. The skills of that very day converted explicitly into capital toward the stated end. Third, and perhaps most easily overlooked, it was phrased in the present continuous rather than the future tense, becoming, not will become, which kept the sentence anchored to action already underway rather than deferred indefinitely to some later date. I want to leave Wrentham standing in that small rented room, speaking his exact sentence into the darkness for what would become, by his own later count, well over 1,000 consecutive nights, because what his mind did with that nightly repetition, and what a second man's mind did with an entirely different nightly repetition, a man I will introduce to you shortly, is the entire content of the law I am here to give you tonight. Here is the mechanism, and I ask you to receive it as a law rather than as an encouragement, because encouragement fades and a law does not. Think of the matter precisely as a student of water and stone thinks of it. A single drop of water, striking a stone once, accomplishes nothing whatsoever. The stone does not notice it. But a single drop of water, striking the identical spot on that same stone, night after night, year after year, eventually carves a groove into rock hard enough to turn any tool set against it. Not through force, for the drop possesses none, but through the sheer, patient repetition of striking the same exact point, until a channel exists that guides every subsequent drop automatically down the path, the earlier drops already carved. I want to press this analogy further, because it explains something people notice but rarely name correctly. A stone struck by water falling in a slightly different location each time never develops a groove at all, regardless of how many years the water falls. The stone remains, essentially, unmarked, no matter the total volume of water that has struck it, because volume without exact repetition of location accomplishes nothing that scattered striking cannot undo. This is precisely why a man who tells himself something different each night, hopeful one evening, doubtful the next, entirely occupied with some unrelated matter the evening after that, carves no groove whatsoever in his own thinking, regardless of how many nights pass, because the striking point has never once remained fixed long enough for a channel to begin forming. I want to add a further observation about the stone itself, because I have found it clarifies why this practice requires the patience it does. The stone does not resist the water out of malice. It resists simply because that is the nature of stone, and any mechanism capable of eventually carving it must respect that nature rather than fight against it directly. A man attempting to force an immediate change in his own instinctive thinking through sheer effort of will applied once or twice is attempting to crack the stone with a single violent blow rather than carve it through patient, repeated contact. The blow may bruise his knuckles. It will not mark the stone. Only the drop, returned to the identical point night after night, accomplishes what the blow cannot. The subconscious mind receives suggestion in precisely this manner. A single vague wish, entertained once, accomplishes nothing whatsoever. It strikes the mind and disperses, exactly as a single drop disperses across dry stone with no groove yet cut to receive it. But an exact, specific statement, repeated in identical form, at the identical hour, when the conscious mind's ordinary resistance has relaxed toward sleep, strikes the same precise location in a man's thinking, night after night, until a groove is cut. A habitual channel down which his instinctive decisions, his daily judgments, his very perception of opportunity begin automatically to flow, without his conscious mind exerting any further effort to direct them there. This is why Wrentham's nightly repetition, apparently pointless to the fellow apprentices who occasionally overheard it through the thin walls of that rented room, was in fact the precise mechanism by which a definite purpose becomes, over sufficient repetition, an instinct rather than merely an ambition. He was not wishing. He was carving. The law is this: the subconscious mind accepts and eventually acts upon whatever specific suggestion is repeated to it with genuine conviction in the hour nearest sleep, and it does not distinguish between a suggestion placed there deliberately and one it merely absorbed by habit from a man's unguarded worry, which means every man is already practicing this law every single night, whether or not he has ever once done so on purpose. Now consider the contrasting case, because a law is never fully visible until you have watched a man violate it and pay the documented price. I knew a man named Cormac Beaudry, a machinist in a manufacturing concern not 30 miles from where Wrentham apprenticed in that very same period. Beaudry was, by every account I gathered from men who worked beside him, the more naturally gifted of the two. Quicker with figures, more inventive with his hands, possessed of a genuine mechanical intelligence that his own foreman once described, in a surviving letter, as the finest he had encountered in 15 years of hiring machinists. I want you to understand the specific weight of that description, because it matters to what follows. This was not a modest talent overlooked by an indifferent employer. Beaudry's foreman recognized his ability plainly, said so in writing, and by every practical measure available to me, genuinely intended to advance him in due course. The opportunity Wrentham eventually built through patient repetition was, in Beaudry's case, already substantially present in the form of a superior's genuine and documented regard. What Beaudry lacked was not the external circumstance. It was the internal orientation required to recognize and act upon it when it eventually arrived. Here is precisely where Beaudry's case diverges from Wrentham's, and I want you to notice that the divergence had nothing whatsoever to do with talent. Beaudry, too, had a nightly practice, though he would never have described it as such, because it never once occurred to him that lying awake reviewing his grievances constituted a practice at all. Each night, before sleep, Beaudry rehearsed, in exhaustive and specific detail, precisely how unfairly he had been treated that day. The raise he had been denied, the credit another man had taken for his own idea, the specific sum still owed him from a debt a cousin had never repaid. He did this not once, but as a settled nightly habit, as consistent in its own way as Wrentham's single-spoken sentence, and considerably more detailed. I want to give you the specific texture of this nightly rehearsal, because a general description alone does not capture its consistency. Beaudry's wife, in an account preserved by their granddaughter decades later, recalled that she could set a clock by it. The same low, muttered recitation of grievances beginning within minutes of the lamp being extinguished, running through what she came to think of, privately, as his list, before he finally fell silent and slept. She recalled trying, on more than one occasion in their early marriage, to gently redirect the conversation toward something more pleasant before sleep. He always returned to the list within a few sentences, as though the grooves already carved by that point were simply too deep to be diverted by a single evening's effort. She recalled one particular evening, early in their marriage, when she had asked him directly why he insisted on ending every single day this way, when surely there were pleasanter thoughts available to occupy the same 10 minutes. He had told her, by her account, that a man owed it to himself to keep his grievances fresh, or the people responsible for them would simply forget what they owed him. It was, she said, the only philosophy of the practice he ever offered her, and neither of them, in all the years that followed, ever thought to examine it any further than that. I want you to understand that Beaudry was not lying about any of these grievances. Every one of them was, so far as I was able to determine, substantially true. His foreman had genuinely passed him over. The credit had genuinely been taken. The debt genuinely remained unpaid. This is precisely what made the pattern so difficult for Beaudry himself to ever examine honestly, because he was not inventing worries to torment himself with. He was simply rehearsing, with total conviction, and in the identical receptive hour Wrentham used so differently, an exact and detailed case for his own continued mistreatment. And the law does not ask whether the repeated suggestion is true. It asks only whether it is repeated, specifically with conviction, in that hour. Beaudry's groove, cut drop by drop across years of nightly grievance, ran in precisely the opposite direction from Wrentham's. His instinctive judgments came to flow automatically toward suspicion of any new opportunity, toward the assumption that any advancement offered him concealed some further unfairness waiting to reveal itself, toward a settled expectation that his labor would continue to be undervalued because it always had been. He did not consciously choose this outlook. It had simply been carved into him, one accurate grievance at a time. In the 1 hour of the day his mind was least equipped to resist, accepting it as the whole and permanent truth of his situation. I want you to ask yourself something now, and I want the honesty of the answer to matter more to you than the comfort of it. What is the exact content of your own mind in the 10 minutes before you fall asleep tonight? Not in general terms. Exactly. What specific sentences, spoken or merely thought, will occupy that narrow and receptive hour? Sit with that question before you continue, because the fear operating beneath most men's inability to answer it with any precision, in the majority of cases I documented, is the fear of poverty specifically, though not always in the form a man would recognize immediately. It is the fear that naming an exact, deliberate suggestion to repeat each night would somehow tempt fate, would expose him to the specific humiliation of having hoped precisely and been disappointed precisely, rather than the vaguer and more comfortable disappointment of having simply hoped in general and been let down by circumstance. This is worth stating plainly, because it explains why capable men like Beaudry never once examine their own nightly habit, while men like Wrentham build theirs deliberately from the very first night. Vague worry, repeated nightly without examination, feels like simple honesty about one's circumstances. It does not feel like a choice, and therefore it never invites the discomfort of being held responsible for its results. An exact, deliberate suggestion, spoken on purpose, cannot hide behind that same comfortable disguise, which is precisely why so few men ever attempt it, though it is also precisely why the ones who do are the ones I found, again and again, at the beginning of every documented fortune I traced back far enough. I want to name a further layer of this fear, because I think it explains something the first layer alone does not. Beaudry's nightly grievances were, as I have already told you, substantially accurate. This accuracy provided him a specific comfort no invented worry could have offered, the comfort of being, each night, demonstrably in the right. A man rehearsing his own legitimate mistreatment need never confront the harder question of what he himself might do differently, because the grievance, being true, requires no such confrontation. Wrentham's exact sentence offered him no comparable comfort. It offered him, instead, the considerably less comfortable responsibility of a stated direction he would eventually be measured against. I want to add one further thought before moving on, because I have found it is the thought that finally moves a hesitant man to action once every other argument has failed to. Consider what it actually costs a man to continue, as Beaudry continued, rather than what it might cost him to begin as Wrentham began. Beaudry's nightly habit cost him nothing in the moment, no discomfort, no exposure, no risk of a stated direction proving false. But measured across the full length of his working life, it cost him everything Wrentham eventually gained, simply distributed so gradually, one unremarkable night at a time, that the true price was never once visible on any single evening it was being paid. Here, then, is the principle, handed over plainly, in language exact enough that a child could repeat it back to you. You are already practicing this law every single night, whether or not you have ever chosen to. The only question that remains is whether the groove being carved into your own mind, drop by drop, in that final receptive hour, is one you selected on purpose, or one that has simply been carved by whatever worry happened to be loudest that particular evening. Remember this: a suggestion repeated once accomplishes nothing. A suggestion repeated nightly, at the identical hour, in identical and exact wording, becomes, over sufficient repetition, indistinguishable from instinct itself. Wrentham understood this from his very first night in that rented room, though he could not yet prove it. Beaudry never understood it at all, though his own nightly habit proved the law with equal force, simply carved in the opposite direction. The difference between the two men, in every measurable outcome that followed, was never talent. It was the presence, in one case, and the absence, in the other, of a deliberately chosen sentence, spoken with conviction, at the 1 hour of the day when the mind cannot help but listen. I will now give you the formula by which this law is deliberately applied, and I ask that you follow it exactly, because I have watched men attempt an approximate version of it and produce results indistinguishable from having attempted nothing at all. First, compose, in advance, a single exact sentence tied directly to your definite purpose. Not a vague wish, but a specific statement naming what you are becoming and the exact means by which you are becoming it. Wrentham's sentence named a specific trade, a specific outcome, and a specific mechanism connecting his present daily labor to that outcome. Your own sentence must do the same, in your own exact terms, before you ever speak it for the first time. I want to caution you specifically against a common error at this first step. A great many men, attempting this exercise for the first time, compose a sentence describing an outcome alone, with no mechanism connecting their present labor to it. Such a sentence, however sincerely spoken, strikes the mind as a wish rather than a direction, and a wish, repeated nightly, carves no deeper a groove than it did the first time it was spoken. Your sentence must name not only what you are becoming, but precisely how today's ordinary labor is already depositing toward that exact end. Second, speak this sentence aloud, not merely in thought, in the final minutes before sleep, every single night without exception. The law does not operate on suggestions merely considered. It requires the sentence to be spoken, with the specific conviction a man brings to a statement he intends, eventually, to make true. The speaking aloud matters more than most men initially credit. A sentence merely thought competes, in the mind, with every other half-formed thought occupying that same hour, and rarely commands the mind's full attention. A sentence spoken aloud, by contrast, requires the whole of a man's attention for the brief duration of its speaking, and it is precisely this full attention, however briefly sustained, that allows the drop to strike the identical point rather than scattering across a dozen competing impressions. Third, repeat the identical wording each night, without variation. A sentence altered nightly cuts a shallow and scattered mark in a dozen different places rather than a single deep groove in one exact location. Consistency of wording is not a stylistic preference. It is the mechanism itself. I want to address a specific temptation that arises at this third step, because I have watched it undo the practice in otherwise diligent men. As the weeks pass, a man's circumstances inevitably shift in small ways, and he feels a natural pull to update his sentence to reflect this fresh detail, believing the update makes the sentence more accurate. Resist this pull entirely for the full 90 nights. The sentence was composed, at the outset, to name a fixed and definite direction, not a running commentary on daily circumstance, and a groove interrupted partway through its carving to accommodate some fresh detail must, in effect, begin again from bare stone. Fourth, guard the 10 minutes preceding this practice as carefully as you would guard any valuable possession. A man who spends the hour before his exact sentence rehearsing the day's grievances, and only then speaks his sentence as an afterthought, has not applied the law correctly. The grievances, repeated first and with equal conviction, will carve their own competing groove, and the two grooves, cut in opposing directions, will produce nothing but a confused and hesitating mind. I want to give you a specific method for accomplishing this guard, because the instruction alone, without a practical means of following it, tends to remain merely theoretical. In the final half hour before sleep, decline any conversation, correspondence, or reading matter concerned with debts, disputes, or disappointments, regardless of how urgently they seem to demand attention in that moment. Nearly every such matter, examined honestly, can wait until morning without genuine harm, while the groove being carved in that final hour cannot be recovered once the wrong drop has struck it. Fifth, maintain this practice for a minimum of 90 consecutive nights before evaluating its effect. Wrentham did not notice any conscious change in his own thinking for the better part of a year. The groove being carved does not announce itself to the conscious mind as it deepens. It reveals itself only in the accumulated pattern of instinctive decisions that follow, examined honestly, after sufficient time has passed for the water to have done its patient work. I anticipate several objections, and I intend to answer each one directly rather than permit it to remain unexamined in your mind. The first objection: that speaking a sentence aloud each night, however sincerely, cannot possibly alter external circumstances that have nothing to do with a man's private thinking. I answer this by pointing directly to the mechanism I have already given you. The sentence does not alter external circumstance directly. It alters the instinctive orientation of the mind that must recognize and act upon whatever circumstance eventually presents itself. Wrentham's exact sentence did not cause a customer to walk through a particular door. It caused Wrentham, when that customer eventually did walk through a door, to recognize the specific opportunity contained in the encounter. An opportunity his own foreman, present at the identical moment, did not recognize at all, because no comparable groove existed in his own thinking to receive it. I want to give you a further illustration of this precise distinction, because it is the point most frequently misunderstood by men encountering this law for the first time. Consider two clerks standing in the identical room, hearing the identical piece of news, that a competing concern in a neighboring town has failed and is liquidating its stock at a considerable discount. One clerk, his thinking oriented by years of deliberate suggestion toward opportunity and definite purpose, hears in this news a specific chance to acquire inventory below cost and expand his own trade. The second clerk, his thinking oriented by years of undirected worry toward scarcity and caution, hears in the identical news only confirmation that trade in general is precarious and that he himself ought to hold what little he has more tightly still. The news itself changed nothing. The groove each man's mind poured it into changed everything. The second objection: that some men, through genuine and severe misfortune, face circumstances no nightly sentence could plausibly overcome. I want to answer this with precision rather than dismissal, because I do not wish to minimize genuine hardship. The law I have given you tonight does not claim that a deliberate sentence removes every external obstacle a man may face. It claims only that the sentence determines whether that man's mind is oriented, instinctively, toward recognizing the narrow paths that do exist through even severe circumstance, or toward confirming, nightly, that no such paths exist at all. In every documented case of severe hardship successfully overcome that I examined closely, the deliberate sentence preceded the recognition of the path, never the reverse. I want to be exact about what I am and am not claiming here, because I have found this objection deserves particular care. A man in genuinely dire circumstance who begins this practice tonight should not expect his circumstance to reverse itself by morning, or even by the 90th night. What he should expect, if the practice is followed exactly, is a mind gradually oriented toward noticing the narrow paths his own worry, left undirected, would have obscured from him entirely. The path itself must still be walked. The sentence only ensures the walking mind is capable of seeing it when it appears. The third objection, and I regard this one as the most serious: that a man reciting a sentence he does not yet believe is engaged in a kind of dishonesty with himself, reciting a lie rather than a truth. I answer this directly, because it deserves a direct answer. The sentence is not a claim about present fact. It is a statement of definite direction, precisely as an architect's drawing is not a claim that the building presently exists, but a specific and exact description of what is being deliberately constructed. Wrentham was not lying when he stated, nightly, that he was becoming the proprietor of his own concern. He was describing, with complete honesty, the exact direction his daily labor was deliberately oriented toward. A description no less honest for being, on any single night, not yet complete. I want to add a further point to this objection, because I have found it is the one that troubles the most conscientious men most deeply, precisely because their conscientiousness is genuine and deserves a genuine answer. There is a meaningful difference between a sentence that describes a direction honestly undertaken and a sentence that claims an outcome already achieved. Wrentham's exact wording, that he was becoming the proprietor, not that he already was one, preserves this honesty precisely. A man troubled by the ethics of this practice would do well to examine his own sentence for exactly this distinction before concluding the practice itself is dishonest. I want to give you a simple test for confirming your own sentence has preserved this same distinction. Read it back to yourself and ask whether a completely honest stranger, hearing it, could reasonably object that it claims something false about your present circumstances. Wrentham's sentence survives this test easily. Nobody could honestly object that a man is lying by describing accurately a direction he has genuinely committed his daily labor toward. A sentence claiming an outcome already achieved, when it plainly has not been, would fail this same test, and ought to be revised before it is ever spoken aloud. The fourth objection: that 90 nights is an unreasonably long trial for a practice that costs a man nothing more than a few spoken words. I answer this plainly. The trial is long, specifically because the mechanism is gradual by its very nature. A single drop does not carve stone. 90 drops, struck at the identical point, begin to. I have never once documented a case in which a man abandoned this practice before 90 nights and reported an honest, thorough attempt at it. In every case I examined of genuine failure, the man in question had altered his sentence, skipped nights, or measured his progress after a mere week or two. None of which constitutes the practice I have described, and none of which the law was ever claimed to operate upon. I want to add one further thought here, because I have found it answers an objection men rarely voice directly, but often feel privately. 90 nights sounds, to a man encountering this practice for the first time, like a considerable commitment measured against the ease of simply continuing as he already has. But I want you to compare it honestly against the alternative, which is not the absence of any nightly practice at all, but the continuation of whatever undirected practice a man is already engaged in, night after night, without ever having chosen it deliberately. Beaudry, too, invested 90 nights, and considerably more than 90, in his own nightly rehearsal. He simply never once considered that investment a choice requiring evaluation, because he had never once made it deliberately in the first place. I return you now to Silas Wrentham, standing in that rented room above the harness shop, speaking his exact sentence into the darkness on what would eventually become well over 1,000 consecutive nights. I want to give you the account of what followed exactly as it was preserved in records his own daughter, decades later, made available to me, because the years between that rented room and what eventually followed are the entire proof of the law I have given you tonight. Wrentham continued his nightly practice without interruption for just over 4 years. In the spring of 1911, the harness shop's proprietor, aging and without an heir interested in the trade, began, without any dramatic announcement, permitting Wrentham increasing responsibility over ordering leather stock and pricing custom work. Decisions the proprietor had, for the entire previous decade, handled exclusively himself. His daughter's records show that the proprietor, in a letter to a supplier, described Wrentham as a young man who seemed, in the proprietor's own words, to already think like a man who owned the place, months before any formal arrangement between them existed at all. I want to give you a specific detail his daughter shared with me about how this responsibility actually began, because it illustrates the mechanism with unusual clarity. The proprietor, she told me, had never once sat Wrentham down to formally discuss the matter. He had simply begun one ordinary week, deferring to Wrentham's judgment on a stock order he would previously have handled himself, apparently on nothing more than instinct that the younger man's judgment could be trusted. When she asked her father, decades later, whether he understood why the proprietor had made that specific decision at that specific time, he told her he had wondered about it himself, until he considered how many years, by that point, his own exact sentence had already been carving the same channel, a channel the proprietor, watching him daily, could not have consciously named, but could evidently sense all the same. I want to add one further detail to this account, because I think it demonstrates the mechanism even more precisely than the promotion itself. Wrentham's daughter told me her father, describing this period late in his own life, insisted that nothing about his outward conduct toward the proprietor had changed at all during those 4 years. He had not become more deferential, or more eager to please, or more visibly ambitious in his manner. What had changed, entirely invisible to any observer, was the specific and settled confidence with which he now made every ordinary decision the trade required of him. A confidence built one nightly repetition at a time, and evidently as legible to an experienced proprietor's instinct as it remained invisible to any deliberate examination. By 1913, Wrentham had purchased a controlling interest in the shop from the aging proprietor, on terms considerably more favorable than an outside buyer would have received, precisely because the proprietor had come, over those years, to trust Wrentham's judgment as though it were already his own. Wrentham's exact nightly sentence, spoken for 7 years before he ever formally owned a single tool in that shop, had carved, drop by drop, the precise instinctive orientation a proprietor requires. And by the time the opportunity to become one actually arrived, the groove was already so deep that recognizing and seizing it required no dramatic transformation at all. It required only the continuation of instincts he had already, patiently, spent years building. Cormac Beaudry, so far as my research was able to determine, remained a machinist for the whole of his working life, at a wage that never once significantly exceeded what he had earned the year I first documented his case. I want to give you one final detail about Beaudry, offered to me by his granddaughter, because I believe it closes his case more honestly than a simple recitation of his unchanged wage. She told me that in his final years, well into old age, he still, on occasion, without any longer being fully aware he was doing it, muttered some version of the old grievances before sleep, a habit so deeply carved by that point that it had long since stopped requiring any actual fresh grievance to sustain itself. The groove, once cut deeply enough, no longer needs the water. It simply directs whatever happens to fall into it, indefinitely, long after the original cause has been entirely forgotten. I told you, at the opening of this address, that there is a specific hour of every day in which the poor man and the rich man do precisely the same thing with their minds, and I promise to show you exactly what that hour determines. I want to leave you with one final observation before I give you tonight's instruction, because I believe it is the observation that will determine whether you act on what has been said here or simply agree with it and continue exactly as before. The difference between Wrentham and Beaudry was never visible from the outside during the years it was being decided. Any observer watching both men in their mid-20s would have seen two capable young tradesmen, neither one obviously destined for a different outcome than the other. The difference existed entirely in 10 minutes of each night, spoken or merely thought in the privacy of a room nobody else ever entered. A difference so small in its daily form that neither man's own employer could have named it, and yet large enough, compounded across years, to produce two entirely different lives. Here is what I am asking you to do before you sleep tonight, and I ask it exactly, without softening any portion of it. Take a single sheet of paper, compose, in exact and specific terms, tied directly to a definite purpose you can name precisely, the one sentence you intend to speak aloud, without variation, every night beginning tonight, for a minimum of 90 consecutive nights. Not a vague hope, an exact statement, naming what you are becoming and the precise means by which tonight's actions are already depositing toward that end. Speak it aloud tonight, for the first time, in the final minutes before sleep, with as much genuine conviction as you can summon. Then speak it again tomorrow night, in identical wording, and the night after that, and every night following, until the 90 nights have passed and the groove has had time to form. I want to leave you with one final thought, because I believe it is the one most likely to determine whether you actually begin tonight or simply resolve, once again, to begin tomorrow. The stone does not care whether you begin tonight or next month. It will remain exactly as unmarked either way, indefinitely, for as long as no deliberate drop strikes it. But every single night you postpone beginning is a night in which some other, undirected drop strikes it instead, because the mechanism does not pause simply because you have not yet chosen to use it deliberately. It is operating on you tonight, regardless, whether or not you have decided what it should be carving. Consider, one final time, the specific difference between Wrentham and Beaudry, because I want it to be the last thing you carry out of this room tonight. Neither man was born toward his eventual outcome. Neither man possessed, at 22, any visible sign of which direction his life would eventually take. The entire difference was decided, one ordinary night at a time, in a room nobody else ever entered, by a choice so small on any single evening that it scarcely seemed worth naming as a choice at all. You are standing, tonight, in the identical room both men once stood in. The only question remaining is which sentence you intend to speak into it. The millions who hear an address of this kind will do nothing with it, precisely as they have done nothing with every prior indication that the hour before their own sleep was shaping the whole of their instinctive lives without their consent. I extend to you, directly, the invitation not to be counted among them. The law has been named. The formula has been handed to you exactly. The water is yours to direct, tonight, toward whatever exact point you finally choose to strike it against.